Well, before that, the IDF over the weekend mistakenly identified a convoy of aid workers as a threat following the emergence of a video which provided or proved that their ambulances were clearly marked when Israeli troops opened fire on them. At least 15 aid workers, including 8 medics working for the Palestine Red Crescent Society, were found in a mass grave after the incident, according to the head of the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Jonathan Whittle. The Israeli military originally claimed an investigation found the vehicles did not have any headlights or emergency signals and were therefore targeted as they looked suspicious. Video footage, however, obtained by the PRCS and verified by media across the world showed the ambulances in a fire vehicle clearly marked with flashing red lights. In a briefing from the IDF, it said the ambulances arrived at Tel Sultan neighborhood in Rafah shortly after a Hamas police vehicle drove through. Let's talk to Eylon Levy, the Israeli government spokesperson here in Tel Aviv. Eylon, great to see you. Thank you for joining us on the program.
I'll just stress former government spokesperson,
right. Former. Didn't want to include you in this administration if you didn't want to be part of it. But thank you for joining us on the program. And I think it must be really hard, listening to the idea of having to admit it did make a mistake with killing those emergency workers. How does that make you feel, hearing the IDF admit this?
Yeah, this is a very serious incident, and it's especially serious because the IDF holds itself to such high standards. Unlike Hamas, which just makes things up and makes up numbers moments after an airstrike, the IDF is very serious about rigorously checking facts, making sure all the information that is given to journalists is accurate. And that's why it's especially upsetting that the initial probe got it wrong. And it's right now that the IDF is saying we're committed to an independent investigation headed by a major general to work out what happened in that incident and make sure that we learn our lessons. Now, this is a very serious incident. And I should say one of the things that makes it serious is that the IDF is saying now that immediately afterwards, 6 of the so-called medics were immediately identified as being Hamas militants. The IDF might not have known at the time, but these were Hamas terrorists apparently inside the ambulance. Hamas has a long-standing strategy of weaponizing ambulances and hospitals. It's been doing it all throughout the war for anyone who's been paying attention, using ambulances to smuggle their terrorists, to smuggle their weapons. And the reason they do it is they think that they can get away with it because they think that they have immunity by exploiting the humanitarian protections of ambulances. It's a sick strategy that puts innocent civilians at risk, and it's a strategy that the world has to insist that the Hamas terror regime in Gaza stop doing.
So, Eylon, the IDF has been generalizing, with Hamas terrorists and saying, every time they're possibly using those ambulances and using, those aid workers' vehicles, but like you rightly pointed out, but in this instance, they weren't. So would it have helped if the IDF had possibly stopped and checked, verified before allowing, the ambulances to go by? It just seemed a bit rash, a bit hasty to assume that there were Hamas militants in the vehicles that those aid workers were in as well.
Look, let's be clear. The facts of the case are not clear yet. I don't know exactly what happened there, and the IDF doesn't know exactly what happened there. That is why it has put in place an independent investigation to get to the bottom of the case and work out what happened. What the IDF says is this: this was taking place in an active war zone. In an active war zone where just an hour earlier at the same spot, there was a shootout with Hamas terrorists who were trying to use the same road. An active war zone in which Hamas terrorists regularly, not rarely, regularly use ambulances to disguise their terrorists, fight out of civilian clothes because they're trying to lay an ambush for Israeli soldiers. How do Hamas terrorists fight? They try to get as close to Israeli soldiers as possible, making them think they're civilians, and then they open fire. So we're dealing with a very complicated urban warfare environment where Hamas is trying to make it deliberately difficult for Israel to separate between civilians and combatants. That's part of the Hamas regime's strategy in order to stay in power, to try to get innocent civilians hurt by fighting out of hospitals, by fighting out of ambulances. Now, I don't know exactly what happened here, and I await to see the results of the IDF investigation so we can get to the bottom of the case. But I would note, unlike Hamas, whenever there is an airstrike, it immediately makes up a number. Israel doesn't do that. In fact, in this case, it took over a week for the IDF to put out its first response. Now, that's too slow, but it does mean that the IDF was waiting for the initial probe, which turned out to be wrong, and they're double-checking it. But the IDF did give time for that initial probe in order to be able to give the media the most honest answers.
Fresh airstrikes on Gaza following Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's order for retaliation for one of the heaviest barrages of rocket fire by Hamas in months. How is it that, recent IDF attacks on Gaza, the buffer zones that, they have expanded, has really not helped in curbing Hamas activities in Gaza?
That's an excellent question. 18 months into the war that Hamas started, the Hamas regime in Gaza is still able to shoot missiles at Israeli homes. Last night, they fired 10 missiles at Israel. 5 of them hit directly. 1 man was injured and had to be taken to hospital. Israelis are saying this war has to end with all the hostages home and with Gaza no longer a threat to Israel. We can't accept a reality that we have a jihadi regime on our borders, right? Our own little Boko Haram that can fire missiles whenever we want. Now, how is it possible that Hamas can still fire missiles? Well, the answer is there are whole areas of the Gaza Strip where the IDF hasn't been operating so far, like the Deir el-Balah area in central Gaza. The reason the IDF hasn't been operating is intelligence that the hostages might be being held there. Let's remember, 59 hostages, 24 are still alive, the rest have been murdered. They're being starved, they're being tortured, they're being held in underground tunnels. And the IDF hasn't been acting in areas where it thinks the hostages are being held because it doesn't want them to be hurt. And that means that there are still areas of Gaza where Hamas's military machine is still intact, and it's still able to use those as a launch pad for murderous attacks against Israeli civilians.
I don't know how much the Israeli people believe that the Netanyahu government is really working to find those hostages, because it has taken so long. There have been a lot of military activity, a lot of deaths so far. They've complained about this ceasefire, which they say Hamas has not observed, and that, it is possible that some hostages may have been killed as a result of these Israeli attacks on Gaza. How much patience do the Israeli people still have for this government to return those hostages?
You raise a very difficult question. Israeli society is united that we have to achieve 2 things, okay? We have to return all the hostages, and we have to remove the Hamas regime from power. Because we can't go back to a world in which Hamas can just invade and take more hostages whenever it wants. Now, how do we get the hostages home? Hamas is holding them for a ransom. It's holding them for a ransom. Hamas is demanding that in exchange for releasing hostages, we will release thousands of convicted terrorists who we know will go back into terrorism and will take more hostages in future. Hamas is demanding an end of the war that leaves Hamas in power, free to plot the next October 7th. So, there's a reason that most countries don't pay a ransom to terrorist hostage takers, because they understand that when you pay a ransom, it only encourages more hostage taking. And Israeli society is having a painful debate about the price that we should pay, the ransom that we should pay to get the hostages back. Everyone wants them home. But many people say we should pay whatever ransom we have to pay, give Hamas whatever we have to give, and other people, including some families of the hostages, say you can't pay a ransom to terrorists. The only way is to keep up the military pressure until Hamas has no option but to release the hostages. But it's a very painful debate in Israeli society. How do you free hostages who are being held by a jihadi regime that is holding them in underground tunnels, that is starving them, and is threatening to execute them if rescue forces get anywhere near? It's an impossible question.
Question, I guess, also impossible to answer. Eylon, thank you so much for speaking with us.
My pleasure.
Former Israeli government spokesperson.